I always thought that 80 years would be an age of wisdom, of peace, of looking back and feeling that it was all worthwhile. But when I got there, what I found was silence. A silence so heavy that it seemed to fill every room in my house, every corner of my life. Before we begin, if these stories of abandonment, silence, and humanity still resonate with you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, we give voice to people who have been forgotten, but whose lives still carry meaning. By subscribing, you'll hear profound accounts of loneliness, empathy, and unexpected twist stories that remind us that no one should grow old unseen. My name is Helena, and for a long time, I believed there was something deeply wrong with me. Because when you get older and realize that nobody sees you anymore, that you could be crying in the middle of a square and people would walk by as if you were part of the scenery, you start to believe that you deserve this, that maybe you were never interesting enough, important enough, lovable enough. I had 3 children. I raised all 3 alone after my husband died, when the youngest was only 7 years old. I worked as a seamstress for 42 years. I would wake up at 5 in the morning, so until my nails hurt, until my eyes burned. I did it because that's what a mother did. Because I loved those children more than I loved myself. Much more. They grew up. They started their own families. And little by little, without anyone openly declaring it, I became optional. First, the visits became less frequent. Then, the phone calls decreased. Then, the forgotten birthdays. The end-of-year celebrations where I was no longer expected, only tolerated when I showed up. I tried to understand. I tried to justify it. They have their lives, their jobs, their children. I didn't want to be a burden, so I started less to expeles. I thought that if I didn't bother them, if I was discreet, maybe they would miss me. Maybe they would realize that I was still there. But the more invisible I became, the more invisible I remained. I started leaving the house just to avoid going crazy within those walls. I'd go to the supermarket, the park, the church, anywhere where there were people. Because even without talking to anyone, being around people made me feel a little less alone. A little less like I'd already died and nobody had noticed. It was on one of those outings that everything started to change. Although, at the time, I didn't know it. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I remember it was Tuesday because Tuesday was the day my daughter used to call me years ago. I still waited, even knowing she wouldn't call. Even knowing that habit had been lost so long ago that I couldn't even remember the last time. I was sitting on a bench in the central square. I had gone to the bank that morning to sort out a problem with my pension. The line was enormous. The teller was rude and treated me as if I were stupid for not understanding the terms he was using. When I left, something inside me collapsed. I sat on that bench and started to cry. It wasn't a loud, dramatic cry. It was a tired cry. The kind of cry of someone who can no longer bear the weight of existing alone without mattering to anyone. People of people. Some glanced at me and quickly looked away as if my sadness were contagious. Others didn't even see me. I was just another old woman sitting on a bench. Nothing worthy of attention. Nothing worth pausing for. And that's exactly what broke me even more. It wasn't just the loneliness. It was the confirmation, right there in broad daylight, that I really didn't matter. That I could disappear and the world would continue exactly the same. I stayed there for almost 2 hours, crying, wiping away tears, crying again, feeling a pain so old and so deep that it seemed to have roots in my soul, until someone stopped It wasn't who I expected. It wasn't a compassionate lady my age. It wasn't a young, soft-hearted mother. It was a man, tall, tattooed, dressed in dark clothes, and with a look that, at another time, I would have judged as threatening. He stopped in there, looking at me. I tried to stop crying, embarrassed. I tried to quickly wipe my face, as if I could pretend everything was all right. Then he crouched down. He was at my eye level, and he said something that I had never, in my 80 years of life, heard from a stranger. He said, "You are not alone." He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't offer solutions. He didn't try to cheer me up with empty phrases. He just said that. And then, something that shocked me even more, he extended his hand and waited. I looked at that hand. I looked at him, and without understanding why, without being able to control myself, I held it. He squeezed my hand firmly, carefully, as if he were holding something precious. And he stayed there. He didn't say anything else. He just held my hand while I continued to cry, now with a different intensity, because someone had stopped. Someone had seen me. When I finally managed to calm down, he asked me if I wanted to have a coffee. I said yes, still not understanding what was happening. We went to a nearby coffee shop. He ordered 2 coffees and a piece of cake for me, and then he began to speak. She said he had lost his grandmother 3 years ago, that she had died alone in her apartment and was only found days later when the neighbors smelled something, that he had never forgiven himself for being so absent during the last years of her life, that he was always busy, always making excuses, always postponing the visit that never happened. He said that since then, every time he saw an elderly person alone, especially crying, he couldn't just walk by. It was like a chance to do for someone else what he hadn't done for his grandmother. I heard all of that, and something inside me began to stir. It wasn't pity I felt. It was recognition. As if his pain validated mine, as if I was finally allowed to feel what I felt. We talked for almost an hour. He told me about his life, about the mistakes he had made, about how he was trying to be a better person, and I, for the first time in years, talked about myself, about my children, about loneliness, about the fear of dying without anyone really caring. He listened to everything. He didn't try to fix anything. He didn't tell me that my children loved me, that I was exaggerating, that things would get better. He just listened, and somehow that was more than any advice could have been. When we said goodbye, he wrote down my phone number. He said he would call me. I gave a sad smile, hoping it was just politeness, hoping I would never hear from him again. But 3 days later, he called, and he kept calling. Et very weak. Sometimes just to see how I was doing. Other times, to invite me for coffee, to walk in the park, just to chat. I started looking forward to those calls. I started getting dressed up on the days I was going to see him. I started to feel like there was something in my week besides the empty waiting. But it wasn't just about him. It was about what he had awakened in me. A question I couldn't stop asking. Why had I accepted being invisible for so long? Why had I let my children treat me like a forgettable obligation? Why had I started to believe that I didn't deserve anything anymore? And that's when something began to change. Not abruptly, not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow awakening of consciousness. I realized that, during all those years, I had lived in a state of waiting. Waiting for my children to call me. Waiting for them to remember me. Waiting for someone to make me feel important. And the more I waited, the smaller I became. the more I disappeared. But when that boy stopped and held my hand, something changed. Not in him, in me. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't expecting it. I was being seen. And that reminded me that I still existed, that I still mattered. Even if not to the person I expected to care. I started going out more. Not to wait for something to happen, but because I wanted to. I started talking to people at the supermarket, at the pharmacy, in line at the bank. Small conversations, nothing deep, but each one made me feel a little more present. And then something strange began to happen. People started responding to me differently. It wasn't obvious at all. It wasn't like the world had changed overnight. But there was something subtle, something I could feel but couldn't fully explain. The cashier at the supermarket, who had always been polite but distant, started smiling when she saw me. Not that automatic customer service smile, a genuine smile. She asked how I was doing. Sometimes she commented on the weather, on a sale. Sampling but feel seen. The doorman at my building, who for years had barely waved at me, started holding the door open, asking if I needed help with my shopping. One day, he told me that his mother was my age and that he worried about her living alone in another city. I didn't understand what had changed. I was still the same person. I lived in the same place. I did the same things. But it was as if something invisible had altered. As if I were emitting a different frequency and the people around me were somehow picking it up. The young man from the square, whose name I later discovered was Raphael, kept calling me. Sometimes he would show up at my building unexpectedly with a cake and fruit just to have coffee with me. He would tell me about his work, the difficulties he faced, and his plans for the future. And I realized something interesting. He never treated me like someone who needed pity. He treated me like a friend, like someone whose opinion mattered. He asked me for advice. He showed me pictures of his family. He included me in his life in a way that my own children hadn't done in years. One day, I asked him why he did that, why he devoted so much time to an old stranger. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that stuck in my mind like a branding iron. He said, "Because you listen to me, really. Most people just wait for their turn to speak, but you listen. And that's rare. That's precious." I was surprised. Because for me, listening was just about being there. Just paying attention. I didn't know that was something valuable. I didn't know I had something to offer beyond my presence. And it was that conversation that planted a seed in me. The idea that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as empty as I had believed myself to be. Maybe I had something that people needed. Something that I had stopped offering because I had stopped believing it was worth anything. I started paying attention to how I felt when I was with Raphael. I felt light, present, interested. I wasn't waiting for him to validate me. I wasn't trying to please him. I wasn't afraid of being discarded. I was simply there, being who I was. And I started to wonder, when was the last time I was like this with my children? When was the last time I wasn't expecting something from them that they didn't want to give? When was the last time I was just Helena and not the needy mother, the neglected grandmother, the annoying old woman? The answer startled me because I realized it had been years, maybe decades. I had become such a small version of myself that I didn't even recognize myself anymore. And that's when I decided to do something that felt both scary and liberating. I decided to stop waiting for my children to reach out to me. I decided to stop checking my phone every 5 minutes. I decided to stop feeling rejected every time they didn't call. It wasn't easy. It wasn't a decision I made once and that was it. It was a decision I had to make every day. Sometimes several times a day. But each time I chose not to wait. Each time I chose to do something for myself instead of being paralyzed by their absence. Something inside me grew stronger. I started taking crochet classes at a church near my house. I met other women my age. Some were also single. Others had families but wanted something for themselves. We talked while we did our crafts. We laughed. We exchanged recipes. We complained about back pain, high blood pressure, and expensive medications. It was comforting. It was simple. Raphael met some of these women when he came to pick me up one day. He talked to them, joked around, made everyone laugh. And then, on the way home, he told me something that made me think for days. He said, "You're different, lighter, more present." I hadn't realized it. But he was right. I was different. And the difference wasn't because of him. It wasn't because of the crochet lessons. It was because of something that had changed inside me. Something I still couldn't fully name, but that I felt in every cell of my body. I had stopped living by waiting, and I had started living simply by living. And it was at that exact moment that my oldest son called. I hadn't spoken to him in almost 2 months. The last call had been brief, polite, distant. He had asked if I was okay. I had said yes. He had said he was busy and would call later. He didn't call, but this time he called, and it wasn't a quick call. He talked to me for over half an hour. He asked how I really was. He told me about the problems he was facing at work, about the difficulties with his teenage son, about how tired he felt, and I realized something incredible. I wasn't anxious. I wasn't trying to prolong the conversation for fear he would hang up. I wasn't playing the victim to get attention. I was just talking, listening, being present, and he understood. Because at the end of the call, he said something that surprised me. He said, "Thank you for listening, Mom." I needed that. I hung up the phone and stared at it for a long time, trying to understand what had happened. For years, I had begged for their attention and received none. And now, when I had stopped begging, when I had stopped waiting, he had sought me out. It could have been a coincidence. I knew that. One phone call didn't mean everything had changed. But something inside me knew it wasn't just chance. It was something bigger, something that had to do with what I was feeling, with who I was becoming. Raphael visited me a few days later. He brought a carrot cake that his sister had made. We sat in my small living room, drinking coffee and talking. I told him about my son's phone call, about how different it had been, about how different I had felt. He smiled. That smile he had, kind of sly, kind of shy, and he said, "I noticed you're radiating something else. I can't explain it, but you are." I laughed. I thought it was an exaggeration, but at the same time, a part of me knew he was right. I was feeling something different, a kind of peace, not the peace of someone who has given up, the peace of someone who has finally stopped fighting against themselves. And it was around noticing in the pan. The neighbor from the apartment next door, who had never spoken to me beyond a good morning in the elevator, invited me for tea. She said she had seen me in the hallway and felt like talking to me. The doctor who had been treating me for years, always in a hurry, this time sat down, looked me in the eyes and asked how I really was, not just physically, but emotionally. how I was living. The priest at the church I attended asked me to help organize a charity bazaar. He said he had observed my work in crochet classes and thought I would be perfect to coordinate a group. They were small things, but together they formed a pattern, and the pattern was clear. The more present I felt, the less I waited for validation, the more I simply was who I was. The more the people around me saw me, they sought me out, they included me. It was as if, throughout all those years, I had been emitting a signal of neediness, of absence, of emptiness. And people, unconsciously, responded to that signal by distancing themselves, not out of malice, but because nobody wants to be responsible for filling a void that isn't theirs. But now I was emitting something different. I was emitting presence. I was emitting life. And people responded to that by drawing closer. My daughter called. The middle one, the one I always felt was the most distant. She was never much of a talker, always more reserved, more to herself. Called Beauty on the weekend. I said yes, trying not to show how surprised I was. She came on Saturday afternoon. She brought a cake and flowers. She stayed for almost 3 hours. We talked about things we had never talked about before, about her childhood, about the fears she had, about the difficulty of being a mother and not knowing if she was doing it right. And I just listened. I didn't try to fix anything. I didn't give her unsolicited advice. I was just there. When she left, je get Marie, allons nug. A hug that seemed to hold back years of distance and a silent longing for closeness. After she left, I sat on the sofa and cried. But it wasn't the desperate crying from the square. It was a etoile relief with gratitude. It was the feeling that something that had been broken for so long had begun to mend itself. And it was also astonishing. Because I hadn't done anything different with her. I hadn't begged. I hadn't demanded anything. I hadn't played the victim. I had simply been myself. The Helena who was learning to exist without waiting for permission. Raphael noticed the change. On one of our walks, he commented that I seemed happier, more whole. I agreed, because it was true. And then he asked me if I thought it had to do with my children being more present. I thought about it before answering, and the answer surprised me. I said no, that it wasn't about them, it was about me. About having stopped putting my whole life in their hands. About having stopped believing that I only existed if they saw me. He nodded, and we stood there in silence for a while, just walking. But inside, I was processing something that scared me and freed me at the same time. I was beginning to understand that all that loneliness, all that abandonment I had felt for years wasn't just their fault. It was also about how I had chosen to live, about how I had become so small, so dependent on their validation, that there was no room left for anything else. And now that I had found this space, now that I had begun to fill it with my own presence, everything was changing. Not because the world had changed, but because I had changed. And the world was responding. In the following weeks, something I never imagined possible began to happen. My 3 children started contacting me with a frequency I hadn't seen in years. Not all at once, not in a coordinated way, but each one, in their own way, began to appear more frequently in my life. The youngest, who had always been the busiest and most distant, called me one Sunday morning. He said he was passing by and asked if he could have coffee with me. He arrived with fresh bread and a shy smile. We talked for hours. He told me things he had never told me before, about the pressure at work, about his marriage, which was going through difficulties, about his fear of not being a good father. I listened to everything, and I realized that, for the first time, he wasn't telling me so that I could solve it. He was telling me because he trusted me, because I was a safe haven, not because I had the answers, but because I knew how to listen without judging. When he left, he kissed me on the forehead, and he said something that echoed in my mind for days. He said, "Mom, I miss you. I miss how you always knew how to be there, even when we didn't deserve it." I stood there in the doorway after he left, those words swirling in my head. Even when we didn't deserve it, did they always know? Did they always realize they were neglecting me and carrying that guilt? I began to understand that perhaps the story wasn't as simple as I had painted it in my head. It wasn't just that they had abandoned me. It was more complex than that. They had distanced themselves, yes, but I had also created a dynamic where my presence was heavy, where every contact came loaded with unspoken expectations, accumulated resentments, and silent demands. And now that I had let go of all that, now that I was no longer expecting them to fill my voids, they were coming back, not out of obligation, but because they wanted to. Raphael remained a constant presence in my life, but our relationship had evolved into something much deeper. He was no longer the guy I'd stopped seeing out of pity. We were true friends. He told me about his dates, about the woman he was seeing, about his plans to go back to school. And I felt genuinely happy for him. I wasn't afraid of losing him. I wasn't afraid that he would find other people and drift away. Because I had learned that people don't fill voids. People share presences. One day, he took me to meet his sister, a sweet woman in her early 40s, who cried when she saw me. She hugged me tightly and said that Raphael wouldn't stop talking about me, that I had helped him heal from the guilt he carried for his grandmother, that he had changed since he met me. I was speechless, because I hadn't done anything other than be myself. But maybe that was exactly it. Maybe being yourself, without masks, without expecting anything in return, was the greatest gift someone can give another person. Crochet classes had become my weekly refuge. The group had grown. We were now almost 15 women, some young, most older, all there for different reasons, but united by the yarn that passed between our fingers and the stories we shared. It was there that I met Donna Aparecida, an 85-year-old lady, widowed for 20 years, who lived alone and rarely received visitors. She was quiet in the first few weeks. She stayed in a corner, doing her work, observing more than participating. But one day, she opened up to me. She told me she had 4 children and that none of them lived in the same city, that they called occasionally, but she felt it was more out of obligation than desire, that she would go entire days without speaking to anyone. I saw myself in her. I saw the Helena from a few months ago, the Helena who cried alone in the square, and I felt such a great wave of compassion that it almost overwhelmed me. I started sitting next to her in class, starting conversations, asking her little questions about her life. And gradually, she opened up, she became more present. And then, something extraordinary happened. In one of the classes, she arrived beaming. She said that one of her sons had called and said he would come to visit her the following month. That it had been more than 2 years since she had seen him. We all celebrated, but I stood watching, trying to understand what had changed. Why, of all times, Had he decided to visit her now? I spoke with Donna Aparecida after class. I asked if she had done anything different, if she had charged, asked, or begged for the visit. She shook her head. She said no, that, in fact, she had stopped mentioning it, that she had stopped letting slip on the phone how lonely she felt, that she had started talking about classes, about new friends, about the work she was doing. And the son had noticed. He had sensed that she was all right, that she was alive, and that had awakened in him the desire to be near her. I went home thinking about it, thinking about how this pattern repeated itself, how, when we stop drowning, people stop being afraid to get close, because nobody wants to be responsible for saving someone who doesn't want to be saved. But everyone wants to be near someone who is alive, who is present, who is whole. My middle daughter started calling me every week. Not long calls. Sometimes just 15 minutes, but she called. And little by little, she told me things I never knew. About how she had felt she was never enough as a child. About how she thought I preferred her siblings. About how she had built a wall around herself so she wouldn't get hurt. I listened to all of that with a broken heart because I didn't know. I hadn't understood. I was so busy surviving, sewing, paying bills, trying to keep the house afloat after my husband died, that I didn't see that she was feeling invisible. But instead of defending myself, instead of trying to justify myself, I simply apologized. I said I was sorry, that I wished I had been more present, more attentive, that I loved her as much as I loved her siblings, but that perhaps I didn't know how to show it in the way she needed. She cried, I cried, and something between us dissolved. A barrier that had stood there for decades, invisible but insurmountable, simply vanished. And then she told me something that made me understand everything in a new way. She said, Mom, I always felt that you needed us so much that I couldn't get close. It was like anything I gave was never enough. But now you're different. You don't need us anymore. And that makes me want to be close. I hung up the phone and sat in the darkness of my room for a long time, processing, understanding. I had spent years believing that if I showed how much I needed them, they would come. But the effect had been the opposite. The more I showed my need, the further they distanced themselves. Because no one can bear the responsibility of being the sole source of another person's happiness. But now that I had found my own life, my own presence, my own joy, they were coming back. Not to save me, but to share. Raphael noticed the transformation. In one of our conversations, he commented that I seemed like a completely different person from the woman he had found crying in the square a few months ago. I agreed, because it was true. I was different, but not because something external had changed, because something internal had changed. I had stopped living in lack, and I had started living in the present. And the more I lived like that, the more life responded in kind. The charity bazaar I was helping to organize was a huge success. We raised much more than we expected, and the priest asked me to continue helping with other church projects. He said I had a gift for bringing people together, for making everyone feel important and included. I had never thought of myself that way. But maybe he was right. Maybe because I had spent so much time feeling excluded, I knew exactly how to make no one else feel that way. I began to realize that my life was full of people, activities, and meaning. And the irony didn't go unnoticed. When I thought I was empty, that I had nothing to offer, I was alone, But when I realized I had so much to offer, that my presence was valuable, people started to appear. It wasn't magic. It wasn't luck. It wasn't a coincidence. It was something deeper. It was an invisible law that I had discovered without seeking it. The law that you attract not what you want, but what you are. And when you are empty, you attract emptiness. But when you are present, you attract presence. My oldest son started visiting me with his grandchildren, something he hadn't done in years. He would simply show up on weekends with the children, and we would spend hours talking, playing, and laughing. My grandchildren, who barely knew me, began to form bonds with me, to ask me questions, to show me their school drawings, to ask me to tell stories. And I realized I was experiencing something I had longed for so long. The presence of my family, the warmth of my grandchildren, the feeling of belonging. But now I wasn't clinging to that. I wasn't afraid of losing them. I wasn't anxiously counting down the days until the next visit. I was simply enjoying the time they were there and living my life when they weren't. And perhaps that was exactly why they kept coming back. Raphael told me he was getting married. The woman he was seeing had said yes. He was radiant, and I was genuinely happy for him. He invited me to the wedding. He said I was one of the most important people in his life, and that he couldn't imagine that day without me. I cried when he told me, but it was a cry of joy, of gratitude, of amazement at how life had changed in such a short time. And then he told me something that summed it all up. He said, "You know, Helena, I met you that day because I was trying to fix my past. But you taught me that we don't fix the past. We live the present so fully that the past stops hurting." I hadn't consciously taught him that, but he was right. That's exactly what I had done. I had stopped living in the past, dwelling on resentment and shortcomings, and I had started living now, here, in this moment, and life had answered. But there was still something I needed to do, something I had been avoiding because I was afraid of breaking the spell, afraid of ruining what I was building. I needed to talk to my children. Really talk to them about everything, about how I had felt, about how they had made me feel, but also about my part in all of this, about how I had contributed to the estrangement. And I knew this conversation was coming. It was approaching like a storm on the horizon, inevitable, necessary. I arranged a lunch with my 3 children. I didn't say why. I just asked that they all be there, that it was important. They agreed, a little surprised. After all, I had never done that before. I had never summoned all 3 of them like that, with such calm firmness. I prepared the food carefully. I made the dishes they liked when they were children. I set the table with the embroidered tablecloth that I had made myself decades ago. And I waited. They arrived almost at the same time. There was a tension in the air, a curiosity, perhaps even a little fear, as if they were expecting bad news, as if I were going to tell them I was sick, that I needed something. But it wasn't anything like that. We sat at the table. We ate. We talked about pleasantries, about their work, about their grandchildren, about the traffic. And then, when we finished the meal, when the coffee was served, I took a deep breath and began. He said he needed to talk about something he'd been carrying for a long time, that it wasn't easy, but that it was necessary. They were quiet, attentive, a little scared. I talked about how I had felt in recent years, about loneliness, about the feeling of being invisible, about the day I cried in the square and thought that nobody in the world cared whether I lived or died. I saw their expressions changing: discomfort, guilt, pain. My oldest son tried to interrupt, tried to justify himself, but I asked him to let me finish. I told him about Raphael, about how a stranger had stopped and held my hand when my own family wasn't there, about how that had broken something inside me, but had also planted something new. And then I told them what I had discovered, about how I myself had contributed to that estrangement, about how my neediness had become a burden, about how I had placed all my happiness in their hands, and that had caused them to distance themselves because nobody can carry that kind of responsibility. She said she wasn't there to blame anyone, not them, not me. She was there to be honest, to tell the truth, so that we could finally truly understand each other. The silence that followed was long, heavy. My middle daughter was crying. My youngest son was looking at his own hands. The oldest had red eyes, struggling not to cry. And then, one by one, they began to speak. My oldest son was the first. He said he always knew I had been absent, that he carried this burden like a stone, that every time he thought about calling me, he felt so guilty that he ended up postponing it. And the more I postponed it, the more guilt I felt, creating a cycle that seemed impossible to break. He said that as a child, after his father died, he had to grow up to fast. He had to be the man of the house, and that this had created in him a hardness, an inability to show affection, to be emotionally present, that he knew this, but didn't know how to change. My middle daughter told me about how she always felt she had to compete for my attention, about how she thought I preferred her siblings, and about how, as she got older, she realized that the best way to avoid getting hurt was to not care, to create distance before the distance was created. She said she always wanted to be close to me, but didn't know how, that every attempt seemed to fail, and that, eventually, she stopped trying. My youngest son, the one who always seemed the most distant, the busiest, spoke last, and what he said broke me and healed me at the same time. He said he always felt he was never the son I wanted, that I wanted him to be like his father, strong, decisive, a provider, but that he was different, more sensitive, more insecure, and that he had spent his whole life trying to prove he was enough, but always feeling like he was failing. He said he walked away because it was easier than seeing the disappointment in my eyes, even if that disappointment might never have existed, even if it was just his interpretation, a wound he carried. I listened to all of that and realized that none of us had been villains. None of us had been victims. We were just wounded people trying to survive, trying to protect our hearts, and in the process, unintentionally hurting each other. I cried. They cried. And for the first time in decades, we truly embraced. Not a polite farewell hug, but a hug of people who are reuniting, of people who are allowing themselves to be vulnerable, of people who are choosing to be present even if it hurts. My daughter said she wanted to start over, that she didn't know how, but she wanted to try. The others agreed, and I said that I did too, that I didn't know what it would be like, but that I was willing to build something new, without carrying the weight of the past. We agreed that we would start slowly, one lunch a month, all together, and that each of them could visit me whenever they wanted, without obligation, without guilt, that the door was open, but that they didn't have to walk through it if they didn't want to, that I had my own life now, and that I was okay, and that this meant that when we were together, it would be by choice, not by necessity. They seemed relieved. And so was I, because for the first time, there were no unrealistic expectations. There were no unspoken demands. There was only the truth, raw, painful, but liberating. After they left, I sat on the porch and looked out at the street, feeling processing. And I realized that something fundamental had changed, not just in my relationship with them, but within myself. I had spent my whole life believing that I needed them bleed. That would have less stone alf. But I had discovered that wasn't true, that I was whole on my own, and that this wholeness was precisely what allowed them to get close without fear of breaking me. Raphael came to visit me a few days later. I told him about the lunch, about the conversation, about everything. He listened attentively, as he always did. And then he said something I didn't expect. He said he was proud of me, that what I had done required a courage that few people have. The courage to be honest, the courage to own up to my part, the courage not to be a victim. I had never thought of it as courage. But maybe it was. Maybe the greatest courage isn't facing the world, but facing yourself, looking at your own shadows, acknowledging your own mistakes. En devantant tu forward different. My children started showing up more often, not all at once, not in a coordinated way, but there was a new frequency, a new lightness. The conversations were more honest. The silences were more comfortable. And when they left, I didn't count the days until the next visit. I simply kept living. Monsieur Aparecida, Fro Group, received fun. She returned to the next class transformed, radiant. She said it had been the best week of her life in years. That they had talked about things they had never talked about before. That he had apologized for his absence, and that he had promised to be more present. I heard that and smiled, because I recognized the pattern. She had changed first. She had stopped living in lack, and life had responded. I started noticing this pattern in other places as well. The cashier at the supermarket, who had always been kind to me, told me one day that she had found the courage to end an abusive relationship. She said she had been inspired by me, by how light and present I seemed despite my age. She said that if I could start over at 80, she could at 30. I was surprised, because I didn't know I was inspiring anyone. I was just living my life, but maybe that's exactly how it works. You don't inspire by trying to inspire. You inspire simply by being authentic. The priest asked me to give a talk at a women's church meeting about aging, about loneliness, about coping with the absence of children. I had never given a talk in my life, but I agreed. I carefully prepared what I was going to say. I didn't want to teach anything. I didn't want to give empty advice. I just wanted to share my experience, to tell my story, and let each one draw their own conclusions. On the day of the lecture, the room was full. More than 50 women, some acquaintances, most strangers, all there with the same look, the look of those seeking answers, of those seeking relief. I began by recounting the day I cried in the square, about loneliness, about the feeling of being invisible. I saw several heads nodding in agreement, several silent, tears streaming down my face. And then I told him about Raphael, about how a stranger had changed my life simply because he stopped, because he saw me, because he held my hand. I talked about discovering that the loneliness I felt wasn't just about being alone. It was about sud-ouest insignifiant, that anymore. And I talked about the change, about how when I stopped living waiting for validation, when I stopped putting my happiness in the hands of others, everything started to change. Not overnight, not like magic, but like a slow, profound, real transformation. I spoke about how our children are not obligated to fill our voids, about how it's not fair to place that burden on them, about how the best thing we can do for them and for ourselves is to find our own life, our own presence, our own joy. And how, when wedotad happens, people start to get closer, not because they need to, but because they want to, because presence attracts presence. When I finished, the silence was absolute. And then, one by one, the women began to speak about their own experiences, about their own pain, about their own loneliness. And I realized that I had touched on something universal, something that all of us, in some way, had experienced or were experiencing. A 90-year-old woman raised her hand. She said she had 5 children and none of them visited her, that she went months without seeing anyone, that she was thinking of giving up, of simply waiting for death to come. I looked at her and saw myself from a few months ago, and I told her what I wish someone had told me. I told her that she wasn't finished, that as long as there was life, there was possibility, that she could choose, now, at this moment, to start living again, not waiting for children to appear, but living for herself, she cried, and then she smiled, a small, shy, but genuine smile. After the lecture, several women came to thank me, to ask for advice, to tell me their stories. And I realized that I had found something I wasn't looking for, a purpose, a reason to be here that went beyond myself. Raphael was at his wedding. I had gone as promised. It was a beautiful, simple ceremony, full of love. Seeing him there, radiant, next to the woman he loved, filled me with a joy I couldn't explain. At the party, he asked me to dance. We danced slowly, awkwardly, laughing, and then he whispered to me, just loud enough for me to hear, "Thank you for letting me save you. Because in the end, you saved me much more." I didn't answer. I just hugged him tighter. Because I understood. I understood that salvation is never a one-way street. That when you help someone, you are helping yourself. That when you see someone, you are allowing yourself to be seen. I returned home that night with a heart full of life, and I realized I had taken a journey I never imagined I would. A journey that began at rock bottom in the town square, crying alone, invisible, and that had led me here, to a moment where I seemed, not because someone gave it to me, but because I had found it within myself. My grandchildren started spending some weekends with me. My oldest son and his wife had decided it would be good for the children to have this interaction, and it was. It was good for them, and it was wonderful for me. But the most incredible thing was that I wasn't clinging to it. When they were with me, I was present, totally present. I played, told stories, baked cookies. But when they left, I didn't collapse. I didn't count the days until the next visit. I simply tomi friand to myself. And perhaps that was exactly why they loved coming. Because there was no weight. There was no guilt. There was no feeling that they had to save me from loneliness. There was only love. Frill one night. Alonatum. I sat on the porch with a cup of tea and gazed at the stars, thinking about everything that had happened, how my life had completely changed in a matter of months. And I realized something that took my breath away for a moment. I realized that nothing external had really changed. My children still had their busy lives. I still lived alone. I was still 80 years old. I still had all the limitations I'd always had. What had changed was me, my inner state, my way of relating to life, my way of relating to myself. And this inner change had created such a profound outer change that it seemed impossible. But it wasn't impossible. It was simply life responding to what I emanated. When I emanated neediness, loneliness, emptiness, life gave me back more neediness, more loneliness, more emptiness. But when I began to emanate presence, life, wholeness, life began to give me back more presence, more life, more wholeness. It wasn't magic. It wasn't luck. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a law, an invisible law, but absolutely real. An ice proof in my own life. The following months brought a stability I had never experienced before. It wasn't the stability of boredom, of empty routine. It was the stability of someone who has finally found their place in the world, of someone who has finally understood that this place depends on no one but themselves. My children remained present, not every day, not in a suffocating way, but in a real way. Monthly lunches became a tradition. Sometimes one or the other would show up midweek, unannounced, just for coffee. And the most extraordinary thing was that I didn't analyze every visit, every call, trying to decipher whether they really cared or if it was just an obligation. I simply accepted it. I accepted what they could give. I accepted who they were. And that acceptance, I discovered, was the greatest gift I could give them and myself. My middle daughter had a serious problem in her marriage. Her husband lost his job and became depressed. She was desperate, not knowing what to do. And for the first time in years, she came to me not out of obligation, but out of genuine need, because she trusted me. I spent days with her, listening, comforting, not trying to solve anything, because I knew it wasn't my place to solve it, but offering my presence, offering my shoulder, offering the certainty that she wasn't alone. And when the crisis passed, when they managed to find a way, she told me something that stuck with me. She said, "Mom, you saved my marriage. Not because you gave advice, but because you showed me that it's possible to weather storms and come out whole on the other side." I hadn't realized I was teaching that, but maybe I was. Perhaps the greatest lesson we can give isn't through words, but through how we live. The crochet group had transformed into something bigger. We were no longer just women doing handicrafts. We were a community, a support network, a place vulnerable kulbadin could be a shoe. Donna Aparecida was unrecognizable. Her son, who had come to visit her, had noticed how well she was doing, how she had found purpose. And this had touched him deeply. He began to visit her more often. He brought his family. He began to truly include her in his life. And she would tell me every week that I had changed her life. But I knew that wasn't quite the case. I hadn't changed her life. I had only shown her, through my own transformation, that it was possible, and she had done the rest on her own. Several other women in the group went through similar transformations, as if there was a contagious energy, as if the change in one woman sparked the possibility of change in others. And I began to understand something even deeper. It wasn't just about me. It wasn't just about my life. It was about something bigger. About how, when you heal, you give permission for others to heal as well. About how your transformation isn't just yours. It reverberates. It expands. Raphael and his wife became a part of my life in a way I never imagined. They visited me regularly. They included me in dinners, outings, in their lives. And I realized that I had gained not just a friend, but a chosen family. One day, his wife told me she was pregnant. I cried tears of joy. And then she asked me something that left me speechless. She asked if I would be the baby's godmother. I was speechless at the time because it wasn't just about the invitation. It was about what it represented. About how my life had expanded in ways I never dreamed possible. The baby was born a few months later, a beautiful girl with huge eyes and an easy smile. And when I held her for the first time, I felt such an intense wave of love that it almost overwhelmed me. But it wasn't a needy love. It wasn't a love that needed to be reciprocated in a specific way. It was a free love. A love that knew that child wasn't there to fill my voids, but to be loved exactly as she was. And perhaps it was the first time in my life that I'd loved like that, without expectations, without need, just pure love. My youngest son went through a professional crisis. He was fired from a job he'd had for 15 years. Paniqued. He thought he had failed, that he had disappointed his family, that he wasn't good enough. He came to visit me one Sunday afternoon. He was devastated, and I just hugged him. I let him cry. I let him release all the pain, all the fear, all the shame. And then I told him about my own fear, about how, when his father died, I thought I wouldn't make it, about how I had to wake up every day and choose to keep going, even when it seemed impossible, about how that choice had made me who I was. He looked at me with an intensity that surprised me, and he said, "I never knew that. I always thought you were too strong to feel fear," and I laughed, a sad but genuine laugh. And I said, "Son, strength isn't about not feeling fear. Strength is about feeling fear and choosing to keep going anyway." He was quiet for a long time, processing, and then he hugged me again, tightly, like a child hugs its mother, like someone who finally allows themselves to be vulnerable. Weeks later, he got a new job, better than the previous one, and he called me, excited, to tell me. And he said that conversation had changed something in him. It had made him realize that failing didn't mean being a failure. It just meant being human. The talks at church became regular. Once a month, I spoke to different groups about loneliness, about aging, about forgiveness, about starting over. And every time I saw the same pattern. Women who felt invisible, discarded, without purpose. And who, upon hearing my story, realized that there was still a possibility, that there was still life. One of these women contacted me months later. She said she had followed my example. She had stopped waiting for her children to see her and had started living. She had enrolled in a painting course she had always wanted to take. She had made new friends. And, to her surprise, her children had started seeing her more. She thanked me, but I told her that the credit was hers, that I had only planted a seed. She had done everything else. And I realized that was it. I was planting seeds, not knowing which ones would germinate, which ones would bloom, but planting them anyway, because it was what I could do. It was my purpose. My 81st birthday was completely different from my 80th. That year, I had spent the lone Croton, Baptiste, my house full. My 3 children were there, with their families. The grandchildren were running around the house, laughing, playing. Raphael had come, wheat the baby, Sariman Freep shut up. The priest from the church sent a cake. The girl from the supermarket sent flowers. I looked around and could hardly believe it. This was my life. These were the people I loved and who loved me back. And the difference wasn't in them. The difference was in me. Because I was no longer waiting to be loved. I was simply being. And love was happening naturally as a consequence. That evening, When everyone had left, I sat on the veranda with a cup of tea, exhausted but deeply happy, and I kept thinking about everything that had happened since that day in the square. A little justagnard, but it felt like a lifetime, because in 1 year I had died and been reborn. Helena, who wept in the square, invisible, abandoned, had died, and a new Helena had been born, a whole Helena, present, alive. And the most incredible thing was that I hadn't done anything extraordinary. I hadn't moved to a new city. I hadn't won the lottery. I hadn't experienced an external miracle. I had simply changed inside. I had simply stopped living in lack and started living in the present moment. And life had responded. Not magically, not immediately, but consistently, truly, undeniably. The more whole I felt, the more people saw me as whole. The more I lived with purpose, the more purpose appeared in my life. The more I loved without needing to, the more love I received. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a law I had proven in my own life, but which I realized was universal. A law that said, you don't attract what you want, you attract what you are. And when you are empty, needy, desperate, you attract more emptiness, more neediness, more despair. People distance themselves because they don't want to be responsible for filling a bottomless pit. But when you are whole, present, alive, you attract more wholeness, more presence, more life. People come closer because they want to share, not because they need to save. It was so simple, so obvious, and yet it had taken me 80 years to understand. Raphael visited me a few days after my birthday. He brought photos from the party, photos of me surrounded by people, smiling, radiant, and he said, look at this. You look 20 years younger. I looked at the photos and he was right. It wasn't just the expression. It was something about the way I was, the way I occupied the space, the way I existed. And then he asked me if I thought all of this would last, if I was afraid that people would drift away again, that everything would go back to the way it was before. I thought before answering, and the answer surprised me. I said no, that I wasn't afraid, because I had understood something fundamental, that it wasn't the other people who had changed. It was me, and as long as I continued to be who I had become, as long as I continued to live from this place of presence and wholeness, life would continue to respond in the same way. And even if, for some reason, people distanced themselves again, even if I were alone again, I wouldn't go back to being that Helena from the square. Because I had discovered something inside myself that no one could take away. I had discovered that I was enough, that I was whole, that I was life. He smiled. That lopsided smile I had learned to love. And he said, you know you saved my life too, right? I shook my head because I didn't believe it. But he insisted. He said that when he stopped in the square that day, he was in a very dark place. He was carrying so much guilt for his grandmother, so much remorse, so much pain, that he was thinking of giving up, of simply letting it all end. But when he saw me crying on that bench, something inside him awakened, a chance to fix what could no longer be fixed, a chance to do things differently. And by helping me, he had begun to heal. And over the months, seeing my transformation, he understood something that changed everything for him. He understood that the past doesn't have to define the present, that you can choose now to be different, to live differently, to love differently. I listened to all of that with tears in my eyes because I didn't know. I didn't know that While I thought he was saving me, I was saving him too. And perhaps it was always like this. Perhaps salvation was never a one-way street. Perhaps when you reach out to someone, you are reaching out to yourself as well. Donna Aparecida died a few months later. It was then a heart attack. She fell asleep and didn't wake up. When I received the news, I felt a deep pain. Because I had become attached to her. Because she had become important to me. But at the funeral, I saw something that comforted me. The church was full. His children were there, crying, embracing each other. And one of them approached me after the ceremony. He said he wanted to thank me. That, in the last months of his mother's life, she had been happier than she had been in years. That she spoke of me, of the crochet group, of how she had found purpose again, and that he was grateful for that. Grateful because his mother had died happy, not bitter and alone as she could have been. I returned home that day with a heavy heart, but also with a certainty. The certainty that life is short. That we cannot waste it waiting. Waiting for someone to see us. Waiting for someone to love us. It's important. We need to leave now. In this moment, we need to see ourselves, love ourselves, make ourselves feel important. And when we do that, the world responds. People appear. Life happens. It's not magic. It's not luck. It's law. The law of life. The law of attraction. The law of the universe. Call it what you want, but it's real. Absolutely real. My oldest son told me in one of our conversations that he had told my story to his therapist, and that the therapist had said something interesting. He had said that I had done what most people spend their whole lives trying to do. I had become responsible for my own happiness. And that was the greatest liberation possible for me and for the people around me. Because when you don't put your happiness in anyone else's hands, you liberate everyone, including yourself. I thought about it a lot, and I realized it was true. For years, I had held my children hostage to my unhappiness, without realizing it, unintentionally. But I had done it, and they had reacted in the only way they knew how, by distancing themselves. But when I freed myself, when I took responsibility for my own life, for my own joy, I freed them too. And then, finally, a real relationship was possible, not based on guilt or obligation, but based on genuine love. Raphael told me that his daughter had taken her first steps. He sent a video. I watched it several times, crying with joy. And I realized that this child was going to grow up in a world different from the one I grew up in a world where her parents had made peace with their own demons, in a world where love wasn't conditional on filling voids. And perhaps that was how things healed, generation by generation, person by person. Not perfectly, not quickly. Peut-être. Today, when I wake up in the morning, the first thing I feel is no longer the weight of loneliness. It's gratitude. Gratitude for being alive, for having another day, for having discovered, even if late, the secret of living. And the secret isn't complicated. It doesn't involve magic, formulas, or special rituals. The secret is simple. Stop waiting for life to happen to you. Start happening for life. Stop waiting to be loved. Start loving yourself. Stop waiting to be seen. Start seeing yourself. Stop waiting to have a purpose. Start being the purpose. And when you do that, when you change your inner state, when you stop living in lack and start living in the present, something inexplicable happens. Life changes. People change. Everything changes. Not because the world has changed, but because you have changed. and the world is merely a reflection of who you are. Sitting here on my porch at 81 years old, looking back and seeing everything that has happened, I can only feel astonishment. Astonishment at having lived so long believing a lie. The lie that I was insufficient, that I needed someone to complete me, that I had no value on my own. But the truth I discovered late, but still in time, is that I was always whole. I was always enough. I always had everything I needed within me. I just needed to remember. I just needed to wake up. I just needed to choose to live instead of merely existing. And you who are listening to me now, you who may be feeling alone, invisible, abandoned, I want you to know you are not alone. You really aren't, because I've been exactly where you are. And I got out, not because someone saved me, but because I chose to save myself. And you can do the same. You can choose, right now, at this moment, to stop waiting, to stop living in lack, to stop believing the lie that you are not enough. You are. You always have been. You just need to remember. And when you remember, when you change your inner state, when you begin to truly live, life will respond. Not immediately, not magically, but consistently, truly. And you'll look back, months or years later, and you'll be amazed at how much everything has changed. And you'll realize that the change began when you stopped waiting for the world to change and started changing yourself. This is my story. This is my truth. And my only wish is that it plants a seed in you. The seed of possibility. The seed that, no matter your matter your situation, no matter how lost you feel, it's always possible to start over. It's always possible to choose life. It's always possible to be seen, starting with seeing yourself. It's always possible to be loved, starting with loving yourself. And when you make that choice, when you change inside, the world changes outside. Not because the world is magic, but because the world is a mirror, and it reflects back what you emanate. Give out absence, and you will receive absence. Give out presence, and you will receive presence. It's simple. It's profound. It's real, and it completely changed my life. If this story touched you in any way, consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications. That way, you'll be notified whenever a new story like this is shared here. And if you feel like it, leave a comment. You can share if you've experienced something similar, what this story evoked in you, or even where you're watching from. Sometimes, writing a few words is the first step in realizing you're not alone.